Fights for the Flag by W. H. Fitchette, published 1912 and read by Cody, author of Auke-wingeke-tawso, or Defender of His Country. Fights for the Flag, Chapter 2, Marlborough and Blenheim.
August 13th, 1704. Quote, "It was the English," Caspar cried, "who put the French to rout, but what they fought each other for, I could not make out well. But everybody said, quoth he, that 'twas a famous victory." End quote, by Southey. Among the historical treasures of Blenheim House is a slip of paper on which are scribbled a dozen lines in pencil. Those lines were written by the Duke of Marlborough at the close of the fierce death wrestle at Blenheim. The tumult of battle was rolling westward, where French and Bavarians were in disordered retreat, with Marlborough's cavalry riding fiercely upon their rear. The smoke of the great fire yet hung black in the heavens. The slopes of the hills to the right, where Prince Eugene had 4 times over made his fiery onset, and the marshy plain in the centre, while Marlborough himself, by a cavalry charge worthy of Murat, 8,000 cavalry, joined in one furious onset of galloping hoofs, had broken through the French centre, where strewn with nearly 30,000 killed and wounded. But Marlborough, with the rapture of the great fight still dancing in his blood, pulled up his horse on one of the little rustic bridges across from the Schwarzbach, and scribbled these dozen lines to his imperious and bitter-tempered wife in London, to tell her of the great event. Marlborough apparently borrowed the scarf of paper from some member of his staff, for on the back of it are the faded items of a tavern bill. He used the parapet of the bridge for a writing desk. He had been 17 hours in the saddle, most of that time riding in the very heart of one of the greatest battles in all history. Yet the firm shape of the letters is a curious testimony to that serenely unshakable temperament which was Marlborough's most striking characteristic. This scrap of paper, tavern bill on one side, martial dispatch on the other, with its few lines scribbled on the parapet of a German bridge, is the record of one of the greatest victories in British history, a victory which has profoundly affected the development of the British Empire. Southey, it is true, affects to doubt whether Blenheim has any genuine historical value. Quote, "With fire and sword the country round was wasted far and wide, and many a childing mother then, and new-born baby died. But things like that, you know, must be at every famous victory. And everybody praised the Duke, who this great fight did win. But what good came of it at last? Quoth little Peterkin, 'Why, that I cannot tell,' said he, 'but 'twas a famous victory.'" End quote. But then Southey's politics colored his poetry. Creasy with justice places Blenheim among the 15 decisive battles of the world. It was a battle in the 17th century which, for a time at least, destroyed the military fame and power of France almost as completely as Sedan did in the 19th century. Quote, "100 victories since Rocroi had taught the world to regard the French army as invincible," noted Green the historian. "Win Blenheim, and the surrender of the flower of the French soldiery broke the spell." But this was the least result of Blenheim. Its great merit is that it shattered absolutely and finally the attempt of Louis to establish a sort of universal empire. Louis is looked at today through the lens of his defeated and inglorious old age, and the true scale of his intellect and of his ambition is not realized. But in the quantities of an imperious will, a masterful intellect, and an ambition which vexed the peace and threatened the freedom of the world, Louis comes nearer Napoleon than not merely any other character in French history, but any other character in modern European history. Quote, "To concentrate Europe in France, France in Paris, and Paris in himself," end quote, was the ideal of Louis, exactly as it was of Napoleon. The two best-remembered epigrams of Louis, quote, "Etat, c'est la mort," and, quote, "There are no longer any Pyrenees," end quote, perfectly express the temper of his intellect and the daring of his schemes. And he came almost as near as achieving the success as Napoleon did. The great Bourbon had 40 years of nearly unbroken triumph. He had at least one faculty of genius, that of choosing fit instruments. Louvois organized his finances, Vauban built his fortifications, Turenne and Villars and Berwick led his armies. Louis's ambition was not perilous to the world, because through it ran a leaven of religious tolerance. His revocation of the Edict of Nantes drove 400,000 of their best citizens of France into exile, while another 100,000 perished of hardship or of imprisonments or on the scaffold. When his grandson ascended the throne of Spain and the Indies, it seemed as if the French king's dream of a world monarchy was about to be realized. The Spain of that date, it must be remembered, included the Netherlands, Sicily, Naples, Milan, half of Italy, in a word, and more than half of America. Here, then, was the menace of an empire which in scale exceeded that of Caesar, and in temper was inspired by the policy which drove the Huguenots into exile, and would have kept the Stuarts, as French pensioners, on the throne of England. As Alison puts it, quote, "Spain had threatened the liberties of Europe at the end of the 16th century. France had all but overthrown them in the close of the 17th." End quote. What hope was there for the world if Spain, that launched the Armada against England, and the French, which drove the Huguenots into exile, were united under a monarch like Louis, with his motto, "To our William III, headed, with much ill fortune, but with quenchless courage, the Confederacy of England, Holland, Austria, and other independent powers against the ambition of Louis." When he died, Marlborough brought to the same great task a happier fortune, and yet more splendid abilities, and Blenheim is the victory, which changed the face of history, turned the thinnest air of ambitious dreams of Louis, saved Protestantism throughout Europe, and secured for the English-speaking race that freedom of development it could never have found under a Stuart dynasty, and which has made possible the British Empire of today. In 1703, Bavaria joined France as an ally, and opened the door for the French generals into the very heart of Germany. At the beginning of 1704, Louis had no less than 8 separate armies on foot, and his field of war stretched from Portugal to Italy. But Louis himself shaped the lines of a campaign which, in boldness of conception, is worthy to stand beside almost any of Napoleon's. One French army was already wintering in Bavaria in combination with the army of the Elector there. Louis's plan was to wage a purely defensive war at all other points. A second French army, under Marshal Talleyrand, on the Upper Rhine, was to march through the Black Forest into Bavaria. Villeroy, with 40 battalions and 39 squadrons, was to move from Flanders on the Moselle, and thence to the Danube. Vendôme, with the army of Italy, was to penetrate through the Tyrol and to Salzburg. Thus, 4 great armies were to converge to a given point in the valley of the Danube, and march upon Vienna, and there finally overthrow the Confederacy. Marlborough penetrated this design to be waging a few more or less inglorious sieges in Flanders, while the French generals were marching on Vienna, was, he clearly saw, to suffer hopeless and final defeat. He met Louis's strategy by a great counterstroke, a march from Flanders through the rough country of the Upper Rhine to the Danube, gathering as he went reinforcements from every side. But the British general had to win a victory in a half-dozen cabinets before he could put a single soldier on the march. He had to persuade Dutch deputies, English ministers, and imperial statesmen to consent to his strategy, and he obtained that consent by concealing its real scale from them almost as completely as he did from Louis himself. Only perhaps to Prince Eugene, a soldier of like spirit to himself, now in command of the Austrian armies, to Heinsius, his faithful ally in Holland, and to Godolphin, his brother-in-law at the English treasury, did Marlborough unfold his complete design. The Dutch would never have consented to fight the French on the remote Danube, but they were lured into the scheme of a march to Coblentz for the purpose of a campaign on the Moselle. Marlborough's movements curiously puzzled the French generals. When he reached Coblentz, everybody believed he was going to fight on the Moselle. When he reached Mayence, it was guessed that he was about to attack Alsace. But when he crossed the Nectar and kept on his steadfast march through Württemberg, his plans soon disclosed. There was wrath in Holland, alarm in Paris, and much agitated riding to and fro betwixt the headquarters of the various French armies. But it was too late for the Dutch to object, and also too late for the French generals to intercept his movements, and it was clear that the combination of 3 French armies under Talleyrand, Marsin, and the Bavarian Elector, Max-Emmanuel, on the Danube, would be met by a counter-concentration of 3 armies under Marlborough, Prince Eugene, and Margrave Louis. Marlborough's march to the Danube was a grand scheme grandly executed. Part of the route crossed the great chain of rugged hills in Württemberg, known by the name of the Raal Alp, the Rugged Alps. But through wild passages, across swift rivers, and in spite of tempestuous weather, the steadfast Englishmen pressed on. The strength of Marlborough's force consisted of approximately 16,000 British, sturdy infantry, equal in endurance and warlike temper to Wellington's light division in the peninsula, or to the foot guards who held the sandbag battery at Inkerman. Among the British cavalry was a regiment of Scots Greys and another of Royal Dragoons, equal in valor to those who, more than a century afterwards, charged across the sunken road upon the French cuirassiers at Waterloo. Their officers were men like Cutts and Rowe and Kane and Ingoldsby, not, perhaps, great generals, but soldiers who, in fighting quality, in the stubborn bulldog pluck that never recognizes defeat, were equally to the Pictons and Cliffords and Colin Champels of later dates. Marlborough crossed the Rhine on the 26th of May. On June 10th, at Muddelsheim, he met Prince Eugene and began one of the most loyal and memorable friendships in military history. 3 days later, the junction with Margrave Louis was effected at Goshawk. The tree still stands, under which, nearly 200 years ago, the 3 commanders sat and planned the campaign which ended at Blenheim. Of that historic 3, the Englishman was, no doubt, intellectually the greatest, and certainly stands highest in fame. He was 54 years of age. He had won no first-class battle yet, but during the next 7 years he was to win a series of the greatest victories in British history. He lacked, perhaps, Wellington's fighting impulse. Marlborough, during 10 campaigns, fought only 10 pitched battles. Wellington in 7 fought 15. But Marlborough never fought a battle which he did not win, nor besieged a fortress he did not take, and in many respects he is the greatest military genius the British race ever produced. The Margrave Louis of Baden owed his place in the group under the historic tree at Grosshoppen rather to his rank than to his military skill. But Prince Eugene of Savoy was in every respect a great soldier. As Stanhope puts it, he was an Italian by descent, a Frenchman by training, and a German by adoption, and in his signature, quote, Eugenio von Savoy, end quote, he used to combine the 3 languages. A little man, black-haired, black-complexioned, with lips cautiously pendulous, and mouth semi-open, but with eyes through which looked a great and daring spirit, Eugene was a soldier as daring as Ney or Murat, and with their delight in the rapture of the onfall, the thunder of galloping hoofs, and the loud challenge of the cannon. But he was also one of the most loyal and generous men, and if Marlborough was the brain of the great campaign just beginning, Eugene was its sword. There is no space to dwell on the immediate movements, nor even on the desperate fight round which Schellenberg, and the stern courage with which the British at last carried it at a loss of nearly 1/3 of their number. On August 11, 1704, the 2 great armies confronted each other at Blenheim. Blenheim is a little village on the bank of the Danube. A stream called the Nebel, gathering its source from the roots of the wooded hills to the west, runs in its front, and curving round so that its course is almost from north to south, falls into the Danube. From Lutzingen, on the lower slope of the hill, to Blenheim on the Danube is a distance of 4.5 miles. Blenheim formed the right wing of the French, and in it Tallard had packed nearly 16,000 infantry, the flower of his troops, fortifying the village with strong palisades. Lutzingen, on the extreme left, was held by Marzen and the Bavarian elector, and from the nature of the ground was almost impregnable. Betwixt these two positions was a marshy plain through which Nebel flowed. In the middle of it stood a village called Auke-wingeke-tawso, held by 14 battalions, amongst which were 3 Irish regiments destined to play a great part in the fight. Tallard covered his centre by a long screen of cavalry, strengthened by 2 brigades of infantry. His position thus was of great strength at either extremity, but his centre, though covered by the Nebel, was strengthened by the village of Auke-wingeke-tawso, and of fatal weakness. And through it Marlborough burst late in this fight, winning his great victory by stupendous cavalry charge. It is curious, however, that Marlborough, though he had a military glance of singular keenness, did not discover the flaw in his opponent's line till the battle had been raging some hours. Eugene, with 18,000 men, was to attack Tallard's left. Marlborough himself, with the best troops, nearly 30,000 strong, 9,000 of them being British, was to attack Blenheim and try and turn the French right. His cavalry was to menace the centre. Tallard had under his command 60,000 men with 90 guns. Marlborough had 56,000 men with 66 guns. Marlborough's weakness lay in the strategy composite character of his forces. The battle, in this respect, has scarcely any parallel in history. To quote the historian Green, quote, "The whole of the story of the Teutonic race was represented in the strange melody of Englishmen, Dutchmen, Hanoverians, Danes, Württembergers, and Austrians who followed Marlborough and Eugene." End quote. Nothing less than the warlike genius and masterful will of Marlborough could have wielded into effectiveness an army made up of such diverse elements. Day broke on August 13th, heavy with mist, and under its cover the Allied forces moved forward to the attack. Tallard was quite unprepared for an engagement when the fog, lifting for a moment, showed the whole landscape before him peopled with moving battalions and fretted with the gleam of steel. Marlborough waited till Eugene could launch his assault on the left wing of the French, and so difficult was the ground that not till nearly 12 o'clock did an aide-de-camp, galloping at speed, announce that the Prince was ready to engage. The fighting on the wooded ridges around Lutzingen was the fiercest. 4 times Eugene landed his troops in furious onset on the enemy, but such was the strength of the position held by the French and Bavarians, and with such steady valor did they fight, that Eugene's assaults were all repulsed, and he himself was only saved from disaster by the iron steadfastness of the Prussian infantry, on whose disciplined ranks the Bavarian cavalry flung themselves in vain. The chief interest of the fight belongs to the left wing and centre, where Marlborough commanded in person. He first attempted to turn Tallard's right by assailing Blenheim. He launched against it a great infantry attack, consisting of 5 British battalions with 1 Hessian battalion under Rowe, supported by 11 battalions and 15 squadrons under Cutts. Nothing could be finer than the onfall of the British. They carried with a single rush some mills which acted as a sort of outpost to Blenheim. Then, dressing their ranks afresh, they moved coolly forward to attack the broad front of palisades which covered Blenheim. The village was crowded with 16,000 of Tallard's best troops. Behind the palisades knelt long lines of infantry, while a second line standing erect fired over the heads of their kneeling comrades. The broad red column, its general, Rowe, leading, came on with iron steadiness. The troops of the disciplined battalions every moment sounded nearer and more menacing. When the British were within 30 yards, the French fired. The long front of palisades sparkled with flame. A furious whirlwind of white smoke covered the whole front, and this was pierced again, and yet again, by the darting flames of new volleys. The British front seemed to crumble under the tempest of fire, yet it never swerved or faltered. On through smoke and flame it came. Rowe led it, moving straight forward till he struck the palisades with his sword and bade his men forward. The whole British front broke at the word into flame. Then the men, their officers leading, tried to carry the palisades with the bayonet. The great breach at Badajoz did not witness a more fiery valor. But Blenheim was held by a force double in strength to that attacking it, with every advantage of position, and a front of fire more than double that of the British, and the attempt was hopeless from the onset. Rowe fell badly wounded, and 2 officers in succession took command after he fell were slain. The men, under the whirling smoke, and scorched with the flames of incessant volleys, were trying to tear up the palisades with their hands or clamber over them by mounting on each other's shoulders. Suddenly, through the smoke on the left, came the thundering gallop of hoofs, and with the long sustained crash 20 squadrons of French horse broke in on the British flank. The men fought in broken clusters with desperate courage, but Rowe's regiment was almost destroyed, and its colours fell into the enemy's hands. Cutts, however, nicknamed by his men the Salamander, from his lust of fighting and habit of always being found where the fire was hottest, had brought up the second line, and the French cavalry recoiled before the stern valour with which the infantry fought. As they recoiled, some squadrons under Lumley came upon them in a gallop, recapturing the colours of Rowe's regiment, and drove the Frenchmen in disorder back to their lines. Marlborough watched the furious strife around Blenheim with steady eyes, and was satisfied that in Blenheim itself Tallard was impregnable. He withdrew his troops from the attack, and men failing suddenly back, full of unsatisfied eagerness for a new assault. But Marlborough had discovered the flaw in Tallard's centre. He kept up the feint of an attack on Blenheim, but commenced to push his cavalry and some battalions of infantry through the marshy ground and across the Nebel, which covered Tallard's centre. It was a difficult feat. Tracks through the marshy bottom had to be made with fascines and planks, and along these the mud-splashed cavalry crept in single file and floundered through the Nebel, or crossed by temporary bridges. Tallard committed the fatal mistake of not charging them till they had crossed in great numbers. Then, while they were busy reforming, he flung his squadrons upon them. But Marlborough had stiffened his cavalry with some battalions of infantry, and while the French and Bavarian cavalry broke in furious waves of assault upon them, these stood, like steadfast inlets ringed with steel and fire, with exactly the same immovable valour the British squares showed at Waterloo more than a century afterwards. Tallard's horse recoiled, Marlborough's squadrons reformed, and the moment for the great cavalry assault, which was to break the French centre and win Blenheim, came. First, however, the village of Oberlaw, which stood as a sort of rocky barrier in the line of the coming charge, and was strongly held by an infantry force, had to be carried. Marlborough launched the Prince of Holstein-Beck with 11 battalions of Hanoverians against the village, but part of the force which held the village consisted of the celebrated Irish Brigade, the last survivors of the gallant and ill-fated battalions who followed Sarsfield into France. Their departure was long remembered in Ireland itself as, quote, the flight of the wild geese, end quote, but the Irish regiments played a brilliant part in the continental battles. After Fontenoy, where the Irish regiments alone proved equal to the task of arresting the terrible British column, George II is reported to have said, quote, cursed be the laws which deprive me of such subjects, end quote. But at Blenheim, the Irish regiment seemed likely, at one moment, to play a part as great as at Fontenoy. They broke from Oberlaw upon the Prince of Holstein's column, tumbled it into ruin, took the prince himself as a prisoner, and hurled his men a mere wreck down the slope. For the moment, Marlborough's centre was broken by that wild charge. The Irish, with characteristic recklessness, were pursuing the routed Hanoverians when Marlborough broke upon their flank with some squadrons of British cavalry. The Hanoverians themselves, a mere tumult of flying men, swept round the flank of a line of steady British foot drawn across the line of their retreat, and this, too, opened a close and deadly fire on the Irish brigades as, breathless and disordered, it came down the slope. With horsemen on its flank and unbroken infantry scourging it with fire in front, the Irish brigade was flung back in defeat to Oberlaw. Then came the great cavalry charge which decided the fight. Marlborough resembled Hannibal in his use of cavalry for the deciding stroke in a great battle, and he had now no less than 8,000 horse, a long line of nodding plumes, and gleaming swords ready to launch on Tallard's center. Behind were steady battalions of infantry, under the cover of those whose fire the horsemen might reform if the attack failed. In front was the long slope, soft with grass and elastic to the stroke of the galloping hoofs, an ideal field for a great cavalry charge. Tallard had drawn up his cavalry in 2 lines and had interlaced them with batteries of artillery and squares of infantry. These were drawn up slightly below the crest of the ridge, so as to exactly cover the summit with their fire. At 5 o'clock, Marlborough launched the great attack. Slowly at first, but gathering momentum as they advanced, the long line of horsemen came upon. The air was full of the clamor of scabbard on stirrup. The squadrons were just stretching themselves out in a gallop as they reached the summit of the ridge, when they were smitten by the fire of the French infantry and artillery. So deadly and close was the volley that the leading squadrons went down before it, and for a few wild minutes, under the canopy of whirling smoke, Marlborough's horsemen were in fierce confusion. That was the moment for the counterstroke. Tallard saw it and gave the word for his cavalry charge. They were more numerous than the British, yet they faltered. Quote, "I saw an instant," wrote the unfortunate Tallard afterwards, quote, "in which the battle was gained." His cavalry, in brief, had charged, but it failed to charge. The moment of possible victory had vanished, and over the crest, with bent heads and wind-blown crests, the gleam of 1,000 swords and the thunder of innumerable galloping hoofs came the British cavalry. Tallard's center was broken, as with the stroke of a thunderbolt. His infantry was swept into ruin, his cavalry hurtled into disordered flight, and his army fairly cut in twain. His left wing fell back, fighting desperately, but his right, the elite of his army, was hopelessly shut up in Blenheim itself. As night fell, Marlborough drew his lines closely around the village. Webb, with the Queen's regiment, blocked one avenue of escape, a cavalry force, one regiment of which consisted of Scots Greys, guarded the other. The French general in command of Blenheim, believing the situation to be desperate, ignobly abandoned his men and tried to swim his horse across the Danube, and was very properly drowned in the attempt. For a time, the fight around Blenheim was furious. Part of the village took fire, and in the light of the red flames, Frenchmen and Englishmen fought hand to hand with fiery valor. But with the center destroyed and the left wing in full retreat, the condition of Tallard's right, shut up in Blenheim, was hopeless, and 11,000 French infantry laid down their arms as prisoners of war. The great French army, 60,000 strong, composed in the main of veterans and familiar with victory, practically ceased to exist. That battle changed the course of history. It destroyed the dream of a universal empire which Louis had cherished for so long. It secured for the Anglo-Saxon race that opportunity of free development which has made the empire of today possible. End of chapter 2.